Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode When You Wish Upon a UFO and Other Topanga Canyon Encounters. Topanga Canyon is located in the Santa Monica Mountains just west of Los Angeles along the Southern California coast. It's a huge hotspot with encounters stretching back really to the 20s and 30s, 40s, all the way up to the present day. But on June 14, 1992, there was a huge wave of sightings and encounters of all kinds. And in fact, this wave lasted for at least 2 years. I ended up writing a whole book about it, and I've done several YouTube episodes on this already, most notably The Night of the UFOs, but also Missing Time on Grandview Drive. There are a few others where I mentioned encounters in Topanga, such as Conversations with Aliens. But in this video, I'd like to do a sort of sequel to these, a follow-up of the many encounters that occurred throughout this wave, before and beyond. As I said, this is a huge hotspot. And the encounters I'd like to cover today are some of the more interesting ones that have occurred there and involve some very unusual elements, which is why I wanted to do this video for you today. And one of these encounters actually involves my own sister. So I hope you find this interesting. And I've got 10 cases I'd like to share with you today. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call It Was There All Night, Kim Smith's Encounter. This occurred in 1974 over the old Topanga Canyon area. This is in the center of Topanga Canyon. And Kim Smith is actually one of the people who had missing time on Grandview Drive and was part of the previous episode, which I already mentioned. But she did have another encounter some years later. And she was out watching the stars late into the night and saw this bright star-like object, which was much brighter than all the stars around, sort of a planet-looking thing, she says. But the problem was it wasn't moving at all. It just hung there in one spot. And at one point it did something which made Kim realize that this was very unusual. And I will just quote Kim directly and let her describe her own sighting in her own words. As she says, "It was a pretty big, bright light, a planet-looking thing. When dawn came, this light that looked like a star just z'd back and forth at really fast speeds and just took off out of the atmosphere. It wasn't a shooting star. It moved in straight lines, but like a zigzag, really fast speed and then out. It wasn't anything I've ever seen. It's a thing I just don't tell people about. I saw it, and it was unusual, and as far as I'm concerned, it was a spaceship." So this was basically a very short sighting of an anomalous light, and that is probably the most common type of UFO that people see. What's interesting about this one is that it stayed there for so long, and she's absolutely sure that this was anomalous because not only did it stay there in one spot for so long, but when it finally did move, it moved in a zigzagging fashion and then accelerated at super high speeds, far faster than any conventional aircraft can do. So yeah, a simple sighting, but interesting nevertheless. And some of these cases that I'd like to tell you next get increasingly interesting, I think. And the next case I want to talk about, I call Anomalous Lights at Night, Johnny's Encounter. Again, this is the most common type of sighting, and I've got many, many of these in Topanga Canyon. So I'm just going to share a few of them with you. This one also occurred in 1974. Johnny and his friends watched a group of star-like objects darting overhead. And what's interesting about this is that these objects were putting on a display that lasted for several hours. And again, I will just quote the witness directly. This is Johnny talking, and I quote, I and some high school friends saw some lights off in the distance that were doing things that planes don't do, turning at right angles and just making weird right angle turns. I don't think a helicopter could have done it. They would just appear, and some of these lights would just sort of go off and on, go at right angles and things like that. I've seen lights directly overhead that covered the sky within 5 or even 2 or 3 seconds. Really, really quick. So this is a type of UFO behavior that is quite out of the ordinary. UFOs are, generally speaking, very evasive, but occasionally they will put on displays and dart around for hours. And that's what they were doing here. And I find this sighting interesting also because these objects would disappear and reappear. That is another type of thing that they apparently have the ability to do. Again, a simple sighting, but interesting nevertheless. And here's one more sighting of an anomalous light at night, which I think you might find interesting. And I call this one U-turn UFO, Eric Andrews encounter. This occurred 2 years later in 1976 in a very rural, remote area of Topanga Canyon. Certainly back then it was rural. And it's called Henry's Ridge. This is on the west edge of Topanga Canyon. And Eric Andrews was with his friends four-wheel driving. And they got stuck and had to walk all the way home. And this was very late at night, so they were out there around 2, 3 a.m. when they had this encounter. And I will just quote Eric Andrews directly, as he says, "We saw a big bright light in the sky, moving real slow, kind of hovering. And then it was moving around, kind of hovering for about a minute or so. It wasn't anything I've seen before. And after about a minute that we were checking it out, it did a big U-turn. Then it took off at incredible speed. It kind of left a trail behind it. Something like I have never, ever seen, and I'll never forget it. I think it was a UFO. And the guys I was with, we all think it was a UFO. The way it took off, it did like a quick U-turn, a big horseshoe turn, and left a trail behind it, and it was gone. It was a chilling experience. It gave me goosebumps. I totally believe in UFOs. I've seen one. This was just way too out of the ordinary. It was really bizarre." So this looks like another UFO that's putting on a display. And I like these cases because they really demonstrate how UFOs can move in unconventional ways. So let's just move along because some of these encounters get really strange and have very bizarre aspects to them, such as this next case, which I call the Deja Vu UFO, Ethan Holtzman's encounter. And while a lot of these earlier sightings that I just mentioned were fairly high up in the sky, that is not true with Ethan Holtzman's encounter. He saw this thing come down right down to ground level. This was on September 22nd, 1992, during this huge wave of sightings from 1992 to 1994. Ethan Holtzman was heading north on Topanga Canyon Boulevard, Highway 27, in the center of the canyon, about 1 mile south of Old Topanga Canyon Road. And again, I will just quote the witness directly. And this is Ethan talking, as he says, "I went around the corner. I was having deja vu. Then I came upon the straightaway, and right up there on the left was where 2 people had died on a motorcycle not too long ago. I had seen the bodies there. And right there, I was having a big flashback or something, like I'd seen it all before. And then I looked up, and there was this huge red ball of fire. And it looked like it just fell. It wasn't a shooting star. It was about 500 times the size of that. I don't know if it was a fireball, but it was red, and it just fell straight down and disappeared. I just stopped. It was really weird because I was feeling so strange just before I saw it. I don't know what it was. I saw a solid mass. It looked about the size of the sun. It was a deep red. I didn't hear any noise. And while Ethan was alone in the car, he was not the only witness. He saw someone else on the side of the road who also saw it and completely freaked out. As Ethan says, I saw a Hispanic guy running the opposite direction after it. I didn't stop though because I was freaking out. I thought the aliens were abducting me. So it is possible he had missing time because he did not see this object leave. It just came down and disappeared. And this is something I have heard from other people who they later found out they were in fact taken on board. Ethan has no direct evidence of this. I've since lost touch with him, so it's very hard to say. But I like this case, this multiple witness case, because it's quite unusual with this deja vu aspect. Not unique though. I've heard other people say that they've had a very strong impulse to run outside, and that's when they saw a UFO or had weird feelings that something was going to show up, and then it did. So there's a very weird aspect, a spiritual aspect to a lot of these encounters. So I wonder if perhaps Ethan had some kind of precognition of this. At any rate, it's a very interesting encounter. Now this next encounter is really why I wanted to do this video. I call this next case, When You Wish Upon a UFO, Valerie Dennett's encounter. This involves my little sister, 3 years younger than me, and her name is Valerie, and her encounter occurred on March 7, 1993, during this huge wave of sightings. At the time, Valerie lived in the heart of Topanga on a road called Observation Drive, which is quite high in elevation and sort of overlooks the canyon. And she had just had a baby. Her baby was 4 or 5 days old at the time of this encounter. And this is when a UFO showed up. It all began around 9:30 p.m. when Valerie and her boyfriend went to bed. He fell asleep, but Valerie was having trouble sleeping. And as she was laying there in bed, she looked over at the window. And the window had curtains on it, which were almost fully closed, but not completely. There was a little crack in the curtain showing the outside. And this is when she saw a star, or a star-like object, through this little crack in the curtains. And as she says, I was laying in bed, looking out the window, and I saw a bright star out of the crack of where the curtains come together. And I wished on the star, like I do sometimes. It was the first star I saw that night. It just looked like a star. It didn't move. So time passed. She got up to feed the baby. She lay back down in bed, and this star-like object was still there in the same spot, which she thought was odd, but she didn't really think much about it, and she eventually fell asleep. However, the next night, the same thing happened again. The curtains were still mostly closed, except for a tiny little strip there. And she was laying in bed and saw this star, or this star-like object, in the crack of the curtains. And she made another wish. She said, "Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might, have this wish I wish tonight." And this is when something really unusual happened. And I'll just let Valerie describe it in her own words. As she says, right after I wished on the star again, the star started moving up and down the crack of where the curtains came together. Up and down, real slow, in a straight line. And then it started moving sideways, horizontally in a straight line. And then it went back to the crack. And the light went out, and the little red light came on, and the little blue light came on a little bit below. And these two lights were moving sideways across the sky. It went on pretty much all night. I fell asleep around 3:30 a.m. It was making me kind of nervous. I thought it might be watching me. It was right in between the curtains. It was freaky. So this went on all night, but at some point She did get up and check this out. She looked outside the window to make sure that this wasn't a weird reflection. It clearly wasn't. This got her curiosity. So she went outside to take a better look and saw 2 more of these objects. So it wasn't just one. There was 3 of them. And as she says, they were red and blue lights. It didn't look like a helicopter or a plane. Plus, it moved back and forth in the same place. An airplane wouldn't do that. At this point, Valerie also noticed another very strange and I think significant detail. As she says, I looked out the window at the other houses, and all the other lights were out in every other house. Usually there are lights on. I guess everybody was out of town or something. I don't know. So this really started to make her nervous. I mean, her baby was just 5 days old, and she felt like this UFO was watching her. So she tried to wake up her boyfriend. And this is when things went from strange to truly bizarre. He would not wake up. No matter how hard she shook him, he wouldn't wake up. It was as if he was in a psychic sleep or something. And this is definitely something I've heard when someone is being taken on board. And I'll just quote Valerie directly. As she says, I tried to wake him up because I got nervous. I thought it was watching me. It stayed there, and then it moved sometimes. I thought it was watching me, and I thought that maybe it was going to come down and take me away, or my baby, because I had just had the baby 5 days before that. I tried to wake him up, but he wouldn't wake up. So as you can see, there are many weird aspects to this sighting. The fact that it appeared right in the crack of the curtains where she could see it. The fact that it's moving in a straight up and down and horizontal fashion in ways that conventional aircraft can't or don't do. The fact that her boyfriend wouldn't wake up. The fact that all the houses around had their lights off, which was very unusual. And especially the fact that she had just had her baby, because this is a pattern I've seen in many cases. The UFOs will show up when someone is 8 months pregnant or have just had their child. I've got several cases of this, and I think this speaks towards the ET's interest in reproduction. And I honestly think Valerie may have had a more extensive encounter. She has no evidence of this, no weird dreams, no scars on her body. But of course, that doesn't mean anything. But really, the fact that, her boyfriend couldn't be woken up, this thing is very close, low down in the sky, all the other lights are off, it's there for hours, her baby had just been born, all these things start to add up. And I think this may be more than just a simple sighting. But the really most interesting aspect, I think, is the fact that this object reacted to Valerie making a wish. That really impressed her. And as she says, I don't know. I was looking at it. It was right after I wished on it because I thought it was a star. Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might, have this wish I wish tonight. Well, I didn't wish for a UFO. And it was just a few months later, on October 18, 1993, that Valerie did see another object swoop low through the canyon, below the canyon walls, which planes or helicopters don't do. It's far too dangerous. This object moved very quickly, and it was gone. But when someone has repeated sightings, that's another strong clue that they are, at some level at least, a contactee. I think Valerie would deny this. And I asked her why she didn't call me, and she said she didn't want to sound like, she was a scared lady calling me in the middle of the night. And I told her, please, just call me next time. I will come down there. I want to see these things. But that has been her last encounter to date. But there are other weird encounters occurring in Topanga Canyon. I'm telling you, if you want to see a UFO, this is a great spot to do it. And this next case is really incredible. It involves a great witness and a very interesting series of events. I call this encounter Helicopter UFO Chase, Dr. David Phillips Encounter. This occurred in September 1993, And Dr. David Phillips was then professor at Santa Monica College. He lived on Fernwood Drive, not far really from where my sister lived, quite high up in the canyon at about 2,000 feet elevation, with a great view of the center of the canyon. And he was woken up at around 2:30 a.m. by the sound of helicopters, very low in the sky. And he got up to check it out and see what was going on. And looking east from his home, he could see that these helicopters were hovering over a very well-known landmark located in Topanga State Park. This landmark is called Eagle Rock. I've been there many, many times. And in fact, all the locals know about it. It's a really cool place with all kinds of caves. And this is where these helicopters were hovering. There were 3 helicopters, all quite low in the sky. One was hovering at about 2,000 feet, he estimates, so it was really at eye level to him. And there were 2 other helicopters that were much lower and were crisscrossing the area, clearly searching for something with their searchlights. And not only that, he saw a park vehicle, or perhaps a law enforcement vehicle, that was barreling down the fire breaks in the state park. This had to be an official vehicle because this area is off limits to any other vehicles. And in fact, there are locked gates that prevent anyone else from going inside. And what really impressed Dr. Phillips is that this vehicle was moving at a very high speed with its headlights bouncing up and down crazily. This is quite dangerous because these fire breaks are not smooth roads by any means. They are quite rough. So he was wondering what the heck was going on. He was very much intrigued, and I will just quote him directly and let him explain what happened next, because it's really incredible. As he says, and I quote, "I sort of watched with great curiosity. I thought, well, it's the sheriff, or somebody's after bad guys in the park. I couldn't figure out what it was. I was standing there watching it. Then, from left to right, going down right over Topanga Creek where the boulevard is, going down the canyon towards the ocean, this craft just went by in my field of vision. It probably lasted 1 or 2 seconds. That's all it took to go from left to right. It was very light, and the helicopters were behind it. And this thing just scooted down the canyon silently. I couldn't see any lights on it. It was just a bright silver and light. It was kind of a disc shaped with sort of like a little bubble on top, a luminous silvery object. It looked like shiny metal. It just transferred very quickly. It was very clear and it was absolutely silent, and it just went down the creek over the highway with the hill in the background." He's absolutely convinced this was not a normal aircraft. It was totally silent. It was far too low. He estimates that it was about 60 feet in diameter and moving fairly quickly, 60 miles per hour or faster. He's absolutely convinced it was a UFO. It had an almost silvery mirror-like finish, and he knew there was UFO activity going on at this time, and he was quite surprised to see it himself. And it was apparently other people had seen it, including authorities, because he believes that these helicopters and emergency vehicles were looking for it. And I did get calls that night from other people who said that helicopters were hovering in the area all night long. So it's a very interesting case, and more evidence that our own government was fully aware of this UFO wave of sightings that was going on in Topanga Canyon. Just cannot go 1 mile in this area without a report being there. And here's another case I'd like to talk to you about, which has some very interesting elements to it. And I call this case Darting Red Light on Mordago Road, Samantha's Encounter. Samantha moved into Topanga Canyon in late 1993. That's not her real name. She did not want to reveal her name. She was quite nervous about being interviewed, had no idea that Topanga was a UFO hotspot. And after she saw this UFO, she actually saw my flyer on the local bulletin board at the little country store there in the center of Topanga Canyon. And she called me to report her sighting. She did not call from her home. She was too nervous. She actually called from the local telephone booth to tell me her sighting. And I had to reassure her that I wouldn't use her name and that I was very much interested in what she saw. And her encounter occurred in February of 1994 on Murdago Road. This is just off Entrada, very near Topanga State Park, and the location of many other encounters in Topanga Canyon. And like I like to do, I will just quote Samantha directly and let her tell you her story in her own words. As she says, and I quote, "I was driving home around midnight up Entrada Road along Murdago. There's one place that has a curve, a panorama, a really good view of the sky. I stopped my car and looked up, and I saw a red light bobbing up and down, just floating and bobbing. And then it would disappear, and it would reappear. It was like it was coming in and out of dimensions into this dimension. And then it would cross really fast, and I would just see this red stream of light where it would cross. And it would appear again, just kind of bouncing and blinking, appearing and disappearing. The main thing that blew me away was how it could move that way. I knew a plane couldn't move that way. It was moving really fast, hopping, appearing and disappearing. It was really beautiful to watch. It moved in straight lines and it was making patterns. It looked like it was almost drawing, like something from geometry or something. It challenged my whole thinking that something could move that way. It was just mind-boggling, but it didn't scare me." She had seen a UFO before, but not like this. It was the way it was moving that really impressed her, the way it was sort of making these geometric shapes. And according to some contactees, they're doing that because they're following the magnetic lines of our planet and are just doing their best to navigate. But she felt like it was almost showing itself off to her, and she was really impressed the way it would disappear and reappear. This is something, again, we hear over and over again, as in the previous encounters. And she said it would move so fast it would leave just a streak of light. That's another thing I hear quite often. But her encounter didn't end there. It went on. And in fact, persistent questioning revealed that she might be, in fact, a contactee. As she says, "I wouldn't be surprised if I was abducted, and I've been suppressing it. I wouldn't be surprised if I've had encounters since I've been here. I have memories of it, vague memories." All right, that's Samantha's encounter. And now let's move on. I've got another very interesting case I'd like to present to you, which I call a fleet of UFOs, Taylor's encounters. This man did not want his real name used, and he only agreed to talk to me because he was moving out of Topanga. He had just moved in there recently along the north edge of Topanga, near what's called the top of Topanga area. And he started seeing UFOs almost immediately. In fact, after he moved in, he told his friend that he had moved to Topanga, and his friend said, "Oh, did you see any UFOs up there?" And he said, "No." And his friend said, "Well, tell me when you do." So that struck him as odd. And then when he started seeing UFOs, he realized his friend must know about the sightings in this area. He was shocked because he did not know that this was a huge hotspot. And his encounters began around March of 1994, and he saw UFOs several times. Often they'd be little objects which he first thought were helicopters, except they made no noise, and they were kind of swirling around and darting in strange patterns. But he didn't really take much notice of them until it kept happening. And a few times he saw a much larger object. and these littler objects were sort of darting around it, like it was a mother ship or something. And I've heard this from other witnesses. And on one time he was driving along, heading south towards the center of Topanga, and this is when he saw a very large object with 10 smaller objects swirling around it. And it came right over his head on this occasion, and this time he heard this larger object. And as he says, and I quote, "I heard like a humming sound. I heard like a humming sound, like, that's what it sounded like. When I saw this, I thought, wow, there must be a lot of people seeing this." They were going down there by the ocean. They were coming down low. It had some speed, but not much. It was so big that you'd think it would have to have more speed to get enough lift. It just kind of cruised. It went by and it was gone. I was getting all scared when I was watching it. It was weird looking. It was strange, whatever it was. It would have been like a disc that's not really round. It looked like some kind of flat thing, but it was long. To me, it looked kind of like a bus, but flatter, not really tall. Mostly, it was just lights. It had colored lights on it. He pointed it out to his wife. She saw it too. And again, they saw these on several occasions. He's absolutely certain now that these were not planes because they were far too low, below the canyon walls. As he says, jets don't come up through the canyon. Not that low. It was just going right up through the middle of the canyon. It was above me, but it was below the mountaintops. It was in the canyon. And after seeing them several times, he became increasingly nervous and absolutely convinced that these were UFOs. As he says, "I believe they're from another planet. I believe there's other people coming here, other space people. Do I think they're UFOs? Yes, I think they're UFOs." So when these encounters continued, Taylor couldn't take it anymore, and he moved out of Topanga Canyon. It's just not something he wanted to deal with. That is something I've heard from other people. And in fact, Samantha, who I mentioned earlier, also ended up moving out of Topanga. And now I want to move to another case, which is not lights. It is a metallic craft. And again, it's got some very interesting elements to it. And I call this sighting "Something I Never Thought I'd See," Bruce Merrifield and Raina Massey's encounter. This occurred on July 16, 1994, about the same time as Taylor's encounters. And Bruce and Raina, were driving south through Topanga. They had just entered the canyon itself from the San Fernando Valley side, the north end, and were driving right through the beginning of the canyon there when they came upon a massive craft hovering very low. And I will just let them describe what they saw. Here is Bruce's testimony, and I quote, "I saw this thing with a bunch of bright lights. All of a sudden, it was appearing over the side of a hill, and then it just stopped, pitched itself sideways, and all I saw was the bottom of it. It was kind of strange. It was only like 100 feet above the ground, and it didn't have any noise. And we have a convertible, and the top was down, so we would hear it. It was really bizarre. It was huge, and it had a weird shape to it. It was like the roof of a house, but it tapered to the bottom. When I first saw it, it had like 16 lights on the bottom. And then, as I turned around to figure out what it was, they quadrupled in number. When we saw it, it stopped. It just stopped cold where it was. And then it turned up, and all we saw was just the bottom. It just stopped there for like 15 or 20 seconds. There was absolutely no noise. For something being that low, you would hear it. I mean, it was right above the peak there, within like 10 or 20 feet above it. I mean, it was low. It was just incredible. It was quite an amazing experience. It was something that I never thought I would see." It's funny that he says that because that's the same quote many of the UFO witnesses say. And Bruce immediately pointed it out to his girlfriend, Raina, who was driving. So she didn't get a chance to really look at it as closely or as long as Bruce did, but she certainly did look at it, and boy was she shocked. As she says, and I quote, "It just turned on its side, and we saw the bottom part. It was facing us, the bottom. It was tilted. I started looking because it was so big, and we were getting close to it. I was like, wow, I don't know what it is." And I kept looking over at it, and it was just so odd. I've never seen anything looking like that. It was very unusual. I don't know if it was a spaceship, but what else could it have been? This one wasn't round, as everyone says it should be. It was like a flying boat. Raina confirms that this object had lights all over it, colored lights, which she says were mostly red and yellow. And as she says, there was a lot. First, there was just a few. Then it turned on its side, and there was a lot more on the bottom. As they watched, this object scooted over the top of the ridge and disappeared to the east. They quickly pulled a U-turn to get a better look at it, but it was too late. By then, this object was gone. What I find interesting about this case is I was in Topanga Canyon at the time, outside, conducting a CE5 meditation with a small group of other people just a few miles away. We were all in a circle meditating, and suddenly I got a very strong impulse to look up. I kept kind of getting almost a telepathic message like, we're here, look up, we're here. And so I don't like to break meditation, but I couldn't help it. The impulse was so strong, I opened my eyes and looked up. And at that moment, I saw a small pinprick of light straight up overhead that quickly expanded in size till it was like the full moon. And then it just got bigger and bigger and covered a huge portion of the sky. This was sort of a milky white light that just kept expanding and expanding in diameter until it was huge. And it was a very quick sighting. It just quickly winked out, and further questioning revealed that my sighting occurred really around the same time or within that hour that Raina and Bruce had their sighting. So I'm wondering if I saw this craft, coming in through a portal or leaving. I didn't see a metallic craft like they did, but I think that this is not a coincidence because we were so close to each other in virtually the same area at virtually the same time. So it's certainly confirmation for both of us to see something unusual at the same time in the same area. And now I'd like to move to the last case in this episode. And I call this case, What Is That? Linda Jordan's sighting. This occurred a short time later in August of 1994, and this occurred again in the old Topanga Canyon Road area. This is where a lot of sightings have occurred. It's really in the heart of Topanga Canyon. And Linda Jordan became very interested in UFOs following this sighting. She was in bed with her boyfriend in this house along Old Topanga Canyon Road when a huge bright light appeared outside, very low in the sky, hovering very near their home. And as Linda says, and I quote, "All of a sudden, there was this huge bright light. And I said to him, 'Look at that.' And he sat up and said, 'Wow, what is that?' And I got up out of bed, and he said, 'You're going to go outside, aren't you?' And I said, 'Yes.' And she went outside, and so did he. He followed her out, and they both saw that this object, this light, was huge, was very low in the sky, was totally silent, was clearly not a plane, helicopter, star, satellite, meteor, balloon, or anything like that. And it was just hovering in place. And in fact, it just stayed there for a really long time. As she says, and I quote, "We watched it for a few minutes, and it was not moving. And it was much, much too bright to be a star. I mean, it was bright enough to make us both get up and go outside to look. And we've never done that before. It was not a plane." So they watched it for several minutes, and it started to get boring, and so they went back inside and looked outside a few minutes later, and it was gone. So they didn't see it move away. They do believe they saw it arrive because they noticed it right away. But it's another example of this unusual activity in the Topanga Canyon area. So those are just a few of the sightings I wanted to share with you in this episode. And what I find interesting about these cases is they have many unusual aspects, such as having deja vu immediately before a sighting, or watching these objects disappear and reappear, or dart at right angles, or fly across the sky all night long as if they're putting on a display, or moving so fast that they leave a streak of light in the sky, or seeing a UFO and having vague memories of being taken on board, or wishing upon a UFO and then it suddenly reacts. I think my sister's sighting is probably one of the most unusual because this UFO showed up right when her baby was only 5 days old. And as I mentioned earlier, this is evidence, I think, that ETs are very interested in human reproduction. And perhaps that's why they showed up for my sister. I don't know, hard to say. I did cover all these cases in my book, UFOs over Topanga Canyon. And as I said, I think these cases have something really interesting to say about the nature of the UFO phenomena and have something to contribute to our understanding of this phenomena. And that's why I wanted to do this video for you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I want to thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking questions. If you want to see a UFO, go to Topanga and keep having fun.